Hey there guys, gals, and those in between. We're back once more to talk about Parasite Eve 2, Square's follow-up to their first cinematic RPG. And yes, I will continue to call it that because they pushed that sucker hard. A critical darling that adapted a popular novel and did it justice. Now we need to talk about the sequel, which is contentious to say the least. Does the game really suck, or are people just judging it too hard? And does the truth lie somewhere in the middle? Sit back, relax, grab a frosty beverage while we explore Parasite Eve 2. Now to start with, we'll go over the development. This, followed Parasite Eve 1, and I forgot to mention, but yeah, the original came out during Square's golden years. There's a reason they have a lot of fanboys from this 32-bit era, myself included, because they were in their Seamus period, and I mean that in the best way possible. Between Parasite Eve 1 and 2, they released Brave Fencer Musashi. Us filthy weebs in the West finally got Xenogears. I'll get to that one day. Man, that tally's getting pretty big. Final Fantasy VIII, which is the best of the PS1 Final Fantasy games, and I will die on this hill. Saga Frontier 2, Threads of Fate, Front Mission 3, Chrono Cross, and here in the West before Parasite Eve 2, Vagrant Story, considered by many one of the greatest games on the original PS1. Do you see this monster of a lineup? Heck, I've done 2 videos on some of the games mentioned here, and Xenogears was gonna be the first if not for technical issues. So us RPG gamers were spoiled for choice. Now, with me glazing the past out of the way, Parasite Eve 2, there really isn't much development history, no crazy stories of it being made from a book, no wacky partnerships, just, hey, part 1 was a success, so now we're gonna obviously do a sequel. The game does have some key players though that we'll get into later. First, I think we'll talk about the game itself and its departure from the original. While Parasite Eve 1 was strictly a role-playing game with survivor horror elements, Part 2 decides to do the inverse, leaning more into survival horror with role-playing elements. The gaming magazines caught on quickly because this time Square actually made playable demos. You can't really do the check out these cutting-edge graphics a second time. Well, unless you're Hideo Kojima, who did just that in Japan, releasing MGS2 DVDs. With these demos, critics were lauding the game before release, and it's really odd. In the years since, it's been established by many that Parasite Eve 1 was a superior title, while 2, doing some good things, has not seen the same critical acclaim in the years since. This was not the case when it was first released. Looking back at old gaming magazines for the previews and reviews for this game, almost everyone mentioned how good Parasite Eve 2 is compared to the original by it stopped being a JRPG. They were not saying, hey, this game is good because it did this, rather it's good because they chose to not do this. I mean, Street Fighter chooses to not be the EX series anymore, but we don't give it extra points for that. Yoshi P of Final Fantasy XIV fame recently spoke on how JRPGs to him seem like a dirty word. And geez, maybe he was right. In doing research for this video, I was looking over some publications like EGM and the official US PlayStation magazine. A big shout out to the Retro Mag's website, a great source by the way. Using these, you can see an image of the past and the general flow of what people at the time thought, and yeah, they weren't that fond of JRPGs. I saw a lot of reviews and previews of Parasite Eve 2 saying things like it does a great thing like getting rid of that nonsense of the first one by having enemies you encounter that you can't run away from, that you have to fight. Firstly, you can flee battles, and also how is a gaming critic criticizing standard RPG conventions? That's insane. That's like if I reviewed a new fighting game was like, it gets rid of tired fighting game conventions like a life bar in rounds. And once more, I'm not being facetious. This was common in all reviews, people stating that Parasite Eve 2 gets rid of the annoying bar from the first one. They mean the ATB bar. That was actually unique in that game and one of its highlights. One review I read went as far as saying it got rid of the RPG elements, which didn't mix well with survival horror. And I just cringed. That'll show that writer. 20 years later, some guy with a Z-list YouTube channel is mocking them. It's a silly idea though. Part 1 is bad because it's an RPG with survival horror elements. Part 2 is good because it's a survival horror with RPG elements. They just did a switcheroo, my guy. Even praising it, a lot of reviewers here seem to complain about the RPG elements. It all seems so silly. I've said it before, I love RPGs, but it was nice to have something outside the world of swords and sorcery. And yeah, I get it, RPGs aren't for everyone, and by consequence of me enjoying them over survival horror, I still prefer the first, but I'm still gonna give the second a fair shake. Now, this is where things start to turn, because as stated, while the second was acclaimed for not being a filthy JRPG within the context of the Parasite Eve series, in the years since, things have swapped back, with now many seeing Part 1 as a superior game and each sequel as more and more disappointing. Part 2 seeming to be considered merely a bad Resident Evil ripoff, mostly because, well, a lot of Resident Evil staff actually worked on this game. I feel like that transition was subtle. But yeah, at the start, Square knew where they wanted to go, and thus they decided to make this a survival horror with RPG elements onto it. Thus, they hired a lot of former Resident Evil staff, including the writer Ken Iwao, who honestly deserves just as much credit for the game's success as Shinji Mikami. After all, they had a lot of arguments which, according to Ken, Mikami wanted to scale back the story as much as possible, with Ken feeling the opposite. And I mean, if that's true, he was correct. Having penned every piece of supplemental info you get in the game, those little notes really fleshed out the world without dragging it, and helped form and build the story of Resident Evil we know and love today. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll just boot up the Resident Evil wiki to read some of those notes. So it's kind of insane though that this didn't happen with this game. But yeah, one of my main issues is the rather scaled back story of Parasite Eve 2. While many felt the bits of exposition detracted from the game, because it was basically do an area and then have a lot of dialogue, which I didn't mind, again, not to beat a dead horse, but this was envisioned as a cinematic RPG. And thus it attempted to emulate a Hollywood movie of that time, where you have your actions then your dialogue. And honestly, the story was so good, I didn't mind it. Plus, this is pretty standard for any RPG. Often after you go to a new town, it's time for a backstory. Here it's similar, but it's a lot less, which is a shame because the plot is the strength of this series, and this game does go into some new and rather interesting directions, which we will discuss. However, without info on these new enemies and allies, it all feels half-baked, which is a sad trend, and even the main antagonist, the Golem number 9, is a letdown compared to how much screen time E from the original received. Once more, Ken, who did all the little notes in Resident Evil 1, and who also argued for more story in this game, directed Parasite Eve 2. So it's a wonder how it ended up feeling so void in that department. We can only guess, it could have been Square not wanting to make a complete copy of Resident Evil, but I think it has more to do with the time it came out in. By the time Parasite Eve 2 was released, the Dreamcast, which is still a top 3 console of all time, and I will also die on that hill, just drag my corpse between that and the Final Fantasy VIII one, was already out, and the PS2 had already been revealed with plans to market it. So I think what happened was, it was made in a time where a delay could just not have happened. Nor could they ask for more resources because Square was already planning for said next generation. I believe this because as soon as Parasite Eve 2 was finished, that team, the team from Musashi and Chrono Cross, were all instantly put on the Final Fantasy XI team. It could also be just as likely, because again, we're just doing baseless conjecture here, that Ken was not only writing but also on directing duties, so he couldn't put his all into writing. You can only stretch yourself so thin after all, and he is a pretty decent writer. It's not as IMDb, but he said in an interview that his longest job was Final Fantasy XI, that he wrote for it for a decade. He then worked on Final Fantasy XIV, so it was clear Square valued him. His last work, unfortunately, was, well, Babylon's Fall, but I can't really judge the writing since the game died in under a year. So Ken is an exemplary writer, and there are some interesting ideas at work here, but because of either splitting his time directing or Square getting ready for the future, we never really see those ideas elaborated upon. The other new hire was Naoshi Mizuta, who was also fresh off of helping Mega Man and Bass. His work in Parasite Eve 2 gets a lot of flack because, well again, Yoko is a legend and the soundtrack of Parasite Eve 1 can only be described as auditory cocaine, with its use of operatic techno. Again, it was so beloved musically it got a remix album. Mizuta decided to go for a different tone instead, for a more ambient pace to better fit the game, even stating that he saw images and scenarios of the game in order to make the tunes, and it took a year and a half, so it's not like he slouched. He even said it was easy to arrange some of Yoko's tracks because of how good they are, and in a rather nice touch, when asked, Yoko spoke highly of Mizuta, saying, "I think Mr. Mizuta's arrangements are very nice because they are sophisticated and have the appropriate mood. He used a lot of phrases which I composed for the original Parasite Eve game, so they remind me of my tunes and I'm glad." So it's not like we were dealing with a rank amateur. The man went on to make the music for one of Square's best games of the last few years in Stranger Paradise, which I say as no joke. That's 3 hills so far. His music is great, but again, the issue is comparison. So, to mimic your mother, it is the Thief of Joy. As stated, Mizuta goes for a more ambient tone that fits the scene and works better for Parasite Eve, which is more of a survival horror game. Yoko's music wouldn't mesh well with how slower paced the sequel is. But I get it, if you do a one-to-one comparison without taking other factors into place, you can poison yourself. Heck, I'm guilty of this. I did this with Saga Frontier 2, saying the music didn't live up to the first one. And yeah, a year later, I found myself humming the music to part 2 after not playing it for a full calendar year. It's stuck in there, in a good way. Yes, I was wrong about Frontier 2. You can stop telling me that I'm a bad man. I mean, you're still gonna do it anyway. So that's my advice. Enjoy the music for what it is. It's change, but a change for the good. And speaking of changes, as stated earlier, Parasite Eve 2 decides to be the bizarro version of the first one. So whether you prefer this or the original will be on you and your preferences. Honestly, even though I do prefer RPGs over survival horror, I feel like most of my contention with the sequel isn't so much they scaled back the RPG elements, but rather they should have made it more of a survival horror romp, or they should have fine-tuned the elements there, because the RPG mechanics that exist seem to more clash with the game than help it, so they really should have been better refined in order to make it more seamless. I would say this is the game's biggest issue, and it all leads back to just that. The game has an identity crisis. So like in the first game, you do have a limited inventory screen, but you can also have respawning enemies, like an RPG to a certain amount. Some of this is good, others not so much. So like most RPGs, if you're in a fight, you cannot change weapons, as opposed to Resident Evil where you can just pause and swap. Here, you just kind of have to stick with what you have. The only way you can swap weapons is if you pick an attachment. Yeah, most armor has attachment slots, which if you find items, you can add more so you can carry things like health items. Because the only way to replenish your health in a fight is either to use magic or use an item that's attached to your armor. And if you have neither, you are out of luck. The same is true of swapping weapons, except here's the thing, if you swap a new weapon, it will have 0 ammo. So you also have to attach the appropriate ammo with the weapon. So that's 2 slots you have to use, which again are pretty limited. You can find extra pouches, but even then, you might normally only have a handful. This is even worse because through the game you find useful items that increase your damage, decrease how much damage you take, and yeah, all those take a slot. So yeah, switching weapons is not going to work because you need those slots for critical items. This is so bad the official strategy guide even goes and says it's better to just equip weapons before a fight. When it comes to actually shooting enemies, my reaction was mixed. See, before Aya shoots, she actually has to lift her gun and aim. So if you just shoot off, you're gonna miss, which can suck because some of these enemies are just frustrating in how limited a window you can hit them. You're not exactly the most nimble being alive, and the tank controls don't help. So either you have to shoot a few times, try to avoid an enemy attack, and then shoot again in a very brief moment, or you just have to tank hits. The camera also doesn't help. You can get a GPS, which helps you find enemies, but sometimes you'll just get hit from something you cannot see, or you just have to aim and hope you hit something. But unfortunately, that was common for survival horrors of that day. Also, yeah, tank controls are here, and hate them or love them, I personally hate them, but that's just something you gotta get used to with older games. Now, while all of that is just okay and for the time, when you add those RPG mechanics, that's when things get out of whack. Again, I don't hate them, and I'm not agreeing with those reviewers because I love JRPGs. It just feels similar to the first, where some of those survival horror elements didn't mix or just needed some retooling. Here, after every encounter, you get EXP and BP, which you need. EXP is what you need for your Parasite energy, which is this game's version of magic. This seems okay, but it's all rather clunky. The first issue we've run into here is you have to decide what magic you want to use, and if you mess up, it can make the game incredibly difficult. But if you elect to learn the right magic, it can also trivialize the game. There really is no in between. And since you need EXP, it means grinding. Looking at the map, you can see red highlighted areas. These are known as hotspots, where there are plenty of monsters for you to face. After certain story events, said spots will repopulate with monsters, so it's not infinite, but the game does expect you to go around and do some killing for that sweet EXP and BP. And with battles not being the most engaging, this is sadly more monotonous than anything. This is what I said about the game's biggest problem is having an identity crisis. How it wants to be a survival horror, and yet now it wants you playing like a role-playing game. Back to the battles, if you're like me and an ammo hog, this can be bad. Certain weapons you can purchase add-ons that give you thunder, flamethrowers, or so on, and you get to refill them for free. So I found myself using said add-ons to primarily fight, but they have a rather low amount. So 2 or 3 fights before going back and refilling said add-on. Maybe doing that I was making it more boring, but the fights I felt weren't the most engaging in either this or part 1, to be honest. Another bad mesh is status effects. They're back and they're even worse. Here they can only be cured via a specific magic, negating via certain armor, or using items. But remember, you cannot use any items in battle if it's not attached to an armor. So if you are out of MP and you didn't attach a specific item to negate the specific status effect, you're out of luck, and it's just annoying and it makes the game not fun. Now we talk about BP, or battle points. Unlike the original that had guns all over the place, including the sewers, here you have BP, which you need to spend for weapons and ammo. And unlike the first one where ammo is shared, here not only do all classes of weapons have their own separate ammo, one for pistols, one for shotguns, etc., but they also have various types, like hollow points. The issue here is you only have 20 slots, so yeah, you can't really be carrying around all this equipment. If you're like me, you're probably gonna have one gun for standard fights and one for boss battles like a grenade launcher. The issue is the game doesn't really give you much info on weapon damage, just really its ammo capacity of weight, which affects reload time. So if you don't know beforehand, you might get stuck with a weapon that just sucks. Another bad mesh is that with its RPG elements, enemies can also be weak to certain attacks. So if you don't have the right magic or weapon, say a flamethrower or a thunder thrower, calls it a taser, but I've never seen a taser work like this, whatever. If you just have normal old bullets, some enemies are basically immortal. And these enemies can be tough. They made these guys real bullet sponges. There was one boss where I used around close to 30 grenades. Grenades enhanced with magic, mind you, before this beefy bastard went down for the 10 count. This feels like a holdover from when it was an RPG because that genre is filled with long boss battles, sometimes to the extreme, but in a survival horror it doesn't make the bosses feel imposing, just more a nuisance. I don't think there's anything in any Resident Evil that would take 30, more like 50 grenades to the face. That's really all for combat, but survival horror is nothing without its puzzles, and these are pretty okay. A common thing I saw while researching this video was that the puzzles seemed more designed to sell strategy guides than anything else. Which, yeah, games like that definitely existed in a pre-internet age. You either had good strategy guides that worked more like supplemental material to the game itself, filling in with cool details or development notes, things like that, and then some are basically buy this to actually play the game. I didn't really see or feel that way with Parasite Eve 2. I mean, the first puzzle boggled me because it involved musical notes, and yeah, I can't read those. After all, I went to a public school, so yeah, I have zero musical education. Anything involving reading music is just gibberish to me. But I never felt aggravated by most of the puzzles. Many of them you just have to think for a bit or find something within the game that gives you the answer. There really wasn't a single time I was like, I could not reasonably find the answer myself. Something insert joke about game journalists having too hard of a time on something simple. I think the issue is that most games there's something you can look back in the game itself, like say Resident Evil, pull up some type of note or something of that nature. Here you might have to actually bust out the pencil and paper and take notes yourself. Me, I typically play near my computer, so I just had a notepad up to take notes for the game and didn't have any issues. So yes, the puzzles are not the Dark Souls of puzzles. The only issue is, well, the game doesn't really tell you or give you the chance to solve them sometimes. As I explained earlier, in something like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, typically a plot-critical MacGuffin will seem out of place in order to draw your eyes towards it. That it's something you need and not just background design. That's not the case here. If you don't know what you're searching for, you're gonna have to keep pressing X and hope you get it. Case in point, for this puzzle, I need to find a magazine. The gray-looking magazine is located on a gray-looking bed that there's no visual distinction that it's not just part of the background. Like, how was I supposed to find this? And I'm playing this on a modern TV, which is pretty decently sized. Imagine trying to find this on a 12-inch CRT. It actually is a real shame the graphics are like this because for the most part, the graphics are improved from the first game, which is saying something considering how good the first one still looks. The character models are much improved, which was really the first one's only flaw, like your partner's ghoulish son. Everyone here looks great. Some of Square's best work with the PS1. Sadly, none of that means nothing if the actual game looks uninspiring. After an admittedly cool first level, for most of the game you're just stuck in a desert town or some underground lab. So I hope you like brown and gray color palettes. Welcome back to the PS3 era for a good 80% of this game. Because this is what we're stuck with, sadly. All the graphics in the world don't mean nothing if the art direction is basically hallways. Which, considering the first game, is underwhelming. So, funny enough, the worst review I read of this game was actually how great this game's location is compared to the first one's use of New York City. Oh, okay, yeah dude, hallways are better than one of the most famous locations in the world. That feels like saying, oh, my favorite Souls area? Yeah, it's the swamp. Which, come on, no one likes the swamp, not even Swamp Thing. Anyway, with that done, it's time to talk about the star of the show, the returning Aya Brea. Aya returns once more as the central figure of the game, and honestly, I really like her new outfit here. According to the artist, Tetsu Nomura, she was supposed to be someone sexy, cool, and stylish. A badass, take-no-crap heroine from the 90s. And here she is back, and yeah, I think her new look is quite stylish. Funny enough, Nomura was not supposed to design her, but the original artist quit, so he just had to finish it. And again, it's not bad. I know I give Nomura a lot of flack, like calling him a sentient hot topic, but that's just me being playful. But there are definitely some designs and characters of his that I am a fan of, and I think Aya is one of his best. Now, similar to Fear Effect, some people dislike that Aya had a shower scene, and of course any commercial had to show these brief moments of PG nudity. Man, to think back in the day, this was all it took to get a lot of people bricked up. The shower scene though is brief, and it comes after a day of trudging through a desert. And as someone who lives through an actual desert, I was like, yeah, I could go for a shower now after that. It's brief, and Aya's sexuality never really comes into play besides that. Now, Aya is great, but seeing as this is a sequel, we do run into more of those common issues that happen with all sequels. In that you have to make some excuse so that she's no longer overpowered. As gamers, we're kinda used to this. Every Metroid, we start off with either Samus being fully geared up, only for something to happen, which isn't an issue. The problem is in how they explain it. Sometimes it's good, and other times it's Samus, for arbitrary reasons, we're not allowing you to use certain abilities unless you get to a certain point in this game. This is something I totally understand, because if you don't, you run into a power creep situation where you have to keep raising the stakes to the point that the end of your adventure looks nothing like the start. The only game where this really worked was something like Dot Hack, which I swear to God I'm working on that video. And that worked because there was a through line thought out. As far as reasonings go, the one here isn't that bad. Basically, Aya didn't like using her mitochondrial powers because it scared others and made her seem not human, so she avoided using it, thus her abilities have atrophied, and that's why you need EXP to reactivate them. Not the worst explanation in the world, and if we went more into Aya and her feelings of alienation and others being afraid of her, I feel like that might go a long way. But all of her coworkers love her. There's really never any show of fear, so I know what they were going for, they just didn't hit the landing. And even though I can accept this reasoning, yeah, there was times where I was just getting beat up 9 ways to Sunday by some llama looking thing just charging at me, and I was thinking, man, remember when I punched a mutant dinosaur in its face? And now I'm getting jumped by llamas. Speaking of our coworkers, I literally forgot most of their names, and I won't bother learning them. Most only have a handful of lines. I really only recall them by your partner, other girl, and Pierce, whose character is being a massive simp for Aya, which, same. The only exception I clearly remember is Kyle Madigan, who supposedly was going to be the main character. I say supposedly because the only info on this is sourced from the Japanese strategy guide, and I don't speak Japanese, so take it with a grain of salt. But according to people who've supposedly read it, early in development this was going to be a spin-off starring Kyle, but then it switched to Aya, which would explain the sudden change in gameplay and once more the spike in difficulty as opposed to the original. It was supposed to just be some guy fighting this beast as opposed to Aya Brea, mitochondrial super soldier. Besides Kyle, there's Golem number 9, who's our recurring antagonist, and another character called Eve, who is not the Eve from the novel or game, who we'll get into later because they're pretty spoiler heavy. I feel like my section minor complaints isn't really enough because we kind of went over everything, -1 is a big one. Remember earlier when I said people complained that the puzzles were made to sell strategy guides? Yeah, no, getting the good ending was made to sell strategy guides. So there are 3 endings here, and the only semi-decent one is the good ending. But you will never get it blind, just never. So there are specific points in the game where you have to do specific things. That's fine, the issue is that there's like 7 of these forks in the road, and the game gives you 0 indication or context clues as to their importance. Literally none. No having a bad feeling, no the game telling you need this, you're not given anything. Even Silent Hill 1, where you're kinda blind, it wasn't that hard to fumble into it. And part 2 did give you a pamphlet to decipher, but here it's like look online or buy a strategy guide, and I mean it. It seems really unfair and only exists to make the player replay the game, but not in a, oh, this is so fun, I can't wait to redo it, more like in a Jesus Christ, I have to replay this game again to get a decent ending. With that out of the way, skip here and we get into the story of Parasite Eve 2. Parasite Eve 2 takes place after the first one, obviously. Aya has left the NYPD, is now part of some FBI group called MIST that deals in mitochondrial beings. Being called to a tower right out of Die Hard in some admittedly cool graphics, you make your way up the tower and see someone transform into a weird monster, which, yeah, you only get a handful of monsters just go around. Well, I feel like that plays to its strength. No need for 300 plus variants in a survival horror. Just a few that have to learn its patterns and attack, that's fine. After finding your partner, who I know has a name, but that's just a partner, and realizing some group was behind it, you make it to the roof and fight Golem number 9. The first boss. What the game doesn't tell you is that it tries this kind of puzzle type bosses where instead of fighting the actual enemy, you can go around and attack these boxes and lure the boss in to take massive damage. If not, he's like most bosses where he'll just sponge hits. So there's actually a lot of scenarios in this game where you just have to look around and it can make things a bit easier. After beating him, your next trace leads you to a desert town, and man, I wish the game kept that up. This idea of a vast nationwide conspiracy and maybe visiting all these different locales, but nope, you're in Dryfield. Welcome to the desert where you'll be spending the vast majority of the game. Here you find only one person inhabiting the town, whose name I forgot. Again, there's no one here that memorable, but he does have a dog named Flint. You best believe I know that dog's name because he's a good boy. Through Dryfield, you see various clues to get a really useful item. That is, if you can actually discern the clues and not go over them as merely pieces of the background. Going through, you find Golem number 9 again. He mentions Eve, and after a quick nap, you see a gun in your face, burn the person holding it, and meet Kyle Madigan. Once more, I like the idea of Aya being afraid and her powers just activating, thus leading her to suppressing them, but this is really the only case where we see that. He's fine, and Kyle mentions teaming up, saying he works for an outside group. After some digging, you realize a place called Shelter holds all the clues. Fixing a truck, you meet a massive boss monster who, if you don't beat fast enough, kills Flint. Now, it doesn't seem like you actually need Flint to get the good ending. Some sources dispute this, but yeah, dude, I'm not letting a dog die. So, beat the monster fast enough, Flint lives, and you go to Shelter. Going to Shelter, you fight another boss, and when you go deeper, you lose track of Kyle. You find a lab facility after some exploration and fight another boss, who you can once again do something neat to make the fight easier. And after you beat him, if you're able to go back to the start fast enough, you can get a medicine wheel that allows you to get bonus items from any of your encounters. Finding Kyle once more, you can either take an elevator or open a gate to get the good ending. Again, the game doesn't tell you, hey, if you take that elevator up, that's it, you're locked out of the good ending. And to make matters worse, how the heck am I supposed to open this gate? It says the code is when the moon is the brightest. I mean, now you can use your phone to find a moon chart and find its apex at the 15-day interval, but the game doesn't tell you that. You're just supposed to know or be back in the year 2000 and bust out an Encyclopedia Britannica. It's complete BS. Back at the Shelter, you see Flint, and if he lived, he leads you back to Pierce, who came to town to try to save Aya, because he's a simp for her. But also, same. He's poisoned, so you gotta give him 3 bags of ice, because that's how that works. I really love when games do weird kooky things like that. You save him, he gives you a rather neat item, and it's back to the shelter to the lower levels called Ark, as in Noah's Ark. Apparently in the Japanese version it was called Shambhala, but it was changed to Ark. But yeah, Ark kinda fits better. You find some researcher who turns to a monster, and it's revealed all the monsters you fought are actually former human beings transformed via Aya cells, and each one made to adapt to certain conditions or environments. Going to the lowest levels in Neo Ark, you discovered that this group was turning humans into these monsters. You then find a little girl named Eve, who's actually revealed to be Aya's clone made for this group's strange purpose. After finding her, you get a phone call from Pierce. After getting a phone call from Pierce, you have to return to a specific room, use the phone, read his note, and then call again, or once more you are locked out of the good ending. Again, the game tells you none of this. Along the way, Eve is kidnapped by Golem number 9. Around now, you start fighting golems, and yeah, they're a pain in the ass, especially the invisible ones that can just command grab you. Going outside, the US Army suddenly comes around and destroys the invading golems. It's actually kind of funny, you had so much trouble with these guys, and then, just a headshot and they're dead. You find Flynn, he is safe, thank God. And he's able to lead you to Pierce to save him. You discover your boss was in on the payroll for Ark, and then find an injured soldier. Finding him allows you the best weapon in the game, a grenade launcher that holds 12 shots. Finding Eve, you find Golem number 9 and Kyle. Golem number 9 is dying. It seems that the golems need to be kept on ice or they'll go kaput, made as a way to control them since they still have some sense of humanity or intelligence. Being out for so long, his clock is ticking, so he wants Eve to merge with this cocoon to make a creature to spread a virus worldwide and turn everyone into monsters. Kyle starts explaining that the Ark was like its purpose, to save humanity by evolving it to these creatures, and that everyone you fought actually willingly gave themselves up to be transformed for eternal youth. And I'm pretty sure that's bull. Like, there has to be some regretful buyers here. Like, yeah, you're gonna be eternal youth. Okay, you're a llama now. What? I'm kinda jesting, but I think this overall story makes sense. After the events in New York, it only follows that someone will capitalize on it, whether it be the army, but I could also see a cult that has a nihilistic view of humanity doing it. Again, just wish we had more, because it's interesting, but it's never expanded upon. Like, were the golems willing? They seem sentient, so are they second-class citizens? If everyone's a monster, who's gonna upkeep them? This is disappointing because those are good plot points that are just never really resolved. So while they're talking, Kyle pretends to shoot Aya, and then shoots Golem number 9, reveals he was playing both sides to find the true culprit. Meanwhile, bam, a laser hits the Ark. All this time we saw what was supposed to be former President Clinton. No idea why they were hiding his face, maybe they were just afraid of, kicking a hornet's nest, who knows. Anyway, former President Clinton was discussing his men on the inside, which was Kyle, and what to do about Neo Ark. It seems they decided to just nuke the thing. It doesn't work, the monster is born, you load like 90 grenades into it, you think that's enough? 90? Before it finally dies. Kyle is left behind saying he'll come back, and you leave with Eve. The incident is covered up, and Kyle is assumed missing, with the president saying leave no loose ends. Everyone goes in their separate ways. A year later, it's revealed Aya adopted Eve as a sister, and then you find Kyle for the happy ending. So boy, that was something. Honestly, I came into this expecting to hate this game with how much everyone says it sucks, but it's not that bad. It just doesn't really know what it wants to be. Once you finish, regardless of the ending you get, you're then rewarded with any BP and excess EXP, and a rank that unlocks a special item for purchase that you can carry over in certain modes, with a certain portion of EXP and BP also carrying over. Beating it on normal, you'll unlock Bounty Mode, where you face tougher enemies like golems from the start to get more BP to purchase more goodies. Beating that unlocks Scavenger Mode, where resources are even more scarce. And beating that unlocks Nightmare Mode, which is indeed a nightmare. It encompasses the difficulty of Bounty with tough enemies, with Scavenger's limited resources, and also Aya being constantly sick. I didn't do any of that. I beat the game once and said I was good. So yeah, I didn't hate the game, I actually had a decent amount of fun, but I didn't really enjoy it nearly enough to do a complete run and unlock every nook and cranny. My main issues are, well, that the good ending is damn near impossible unless you know what you're doing. And the fact that the RPG mechanics that remain, like tanky bosses, don't really mix well with the game. I feel like this game either needed more time in the oven or for said elements to be refined, or maybe both. Again, it's not the worst survival horror, but also not the best. I for sure played much worse survival horror games, and once more I do like what the story attempts to do, and feels like it's a natural evolution of the first game. Overall, I came out thinking it was pretty okay. The one thing is you can't go in blind, you're gonna have a bad time, and while I still enjoy the original the best, the second is a novel attempt, which does some things, but more often than not either doesn't land, or it has things that are good, but they just simply aren't fleshed out or used wrong. It seems for every plus, there is a minus. It has great graphics that step up from the original, but most of the game is a desert or some labs, so you can't fully appreciate it. It has interesting story threads, but they never get expanded upon. You get a limited inventory space, like most survival horrors, to ramp up the tension, but like an RPG, they give you 1.5 million different items, which just makes it cumbersome. The game isn't exactly scary, and the enemies are more annoying than they are difficult, but the idea that your survival horror can only be if you're a weak little baby is silly and dumb. Besides, people love Resident Evil 4, and yeah, Leon's basically a super cop in that one. With all that said, Parasite Eve 2 still provides an interesting story and decent gameplay. To me, it's a solid 3. You can beat it in a day, so if you're a survival horror fan and haven't tried this one, or maybe you heard 2 is just crap and decided to overlook it, I'd say give it a shot. It's just a shame that Square decided to leave Parasite Eve dormant for over a decade and not continue to evolve the series to what it could be. We would have to wait until the PSP arrived for Aya's adventures to continue and see what happens next. Well guys, gals, and those in between, that's it for this rendition. I want to say thanks for all the love in the previous video. I was honestly not expecting that. I made a community post, but yeah, we're doing the 3rd birthday, but in between I'm going to do a more short form series about games that I don't think I can do a massive video on. So be on the lookout for that. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, send it to your friends. If you hated it, send it to your enemies. Catch you later. Stay blessed.